Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Gulf Intelligence Global UA Energy Forum 2021, the kickoff of the Europe section of the forum. We've been through Asia, we've been through the Middle East, and now we are in Europe. And no better place to stop than in Paris, where the IEA World Energy Outlook will be presented by Tim Gould, the head of division for energy supply outlooks and investment at the International Energy Agency. Tim, welcome. We look forward to hearing your presentation, and then maybe after about 10 minutes, we'll do some follow-up with some questions. And if anybody in the chat room would like to post any questions for Tim, please put them in there and I'll pick them up and present them to Tim. But Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. It's a great pleasure to join this event today. I hope you can all see my screen. I'd like to talk through some findings from our recent work, which naturally enough focused heavily on the effects of the pandemic on the energy outlook. The opening picture is one that may be familiar to many of you. 5% drop in energy demand in 2020 spread unevenly across different fuels and technologies. That produced a 7% drop in CO2 emissions and an even larger fall in energy investment. You may well be familiar with this picture, but it's worth remembering we haven't seen anything like this for 70 years. Big question that we had to pose for ourselves is what happens next? And there we were grappling with two big uncertainties: the duration and severity of the pandemic and the response from policymakers. And a large part of our efforts in the last, over the last year in practice has been to provide insight and guidance on those two issues. When we think about the future in our World Energy Outlook, we have to have a scenario mentality. There are so many uncertainties around there. We don't do a forecast. And this is the same starting point for 2020. And we thought through what would happen, if we take the policies that are in place today, or the things that governments have announced and that have some substance to them, and we assume that the pandemic is brought under control over the course of 2021. In that case, oil demand gets back to pre-crisis levels within a few years, but you can see there's no such rebound for coal. Coal is under real pressure today from phase-out policies, from low natural gas prices in many regions, and the rise of renewables, of course. The main growth over the next 10 years to 2030 would come from natural gas, but especially from renewables. But we also had to think through what would happen if this recovery was delayed. What if the pandemic is prolonged? What if we don't get it under control in 2021? Some investments in renewables are postponed because of the economic uncertainty and the weaker growth in electricity demand, but the bigger effects are elsewhere. So if you think through a delayed recovery scenario, almost all of the growth in oil demand to 2030 is wiped out. Coal and natural gas are much more affected by the weaker economic outlook. I'd like to think through also some other impacts of the crisis, a number of problems created or exacerbated by what we saw in 2020. The first of those in energy access. We're just looking at the picture in Africa here. The number of people without access to electricity has actually been decreasing since 2013, thanks to the progress made in several countries such as Kenya, Senegal, Rwanda, Ghana. But that trend was reversed. That encouraging trend was reversed in 2020. And we're also seeing some evidence that people who had previously gained access to electricity are being pushed by the crisis back into a situation where they can't afford basic energy services. And a related issue is the way that the pandemic is exacerbating some pre-crisis imbalances in the cost and availability of capital. So the bulk of future investment needs are in emerging economies, in developing economies, and that's pretty much where all of the growth, projected growth in global energy demand comes from. But whereas many major economies are set for an extended period of very low borrowing costs, the same is not true elsewhere. So increased debt, increased perceptions of risk, pushing up borrowing costs in some emerging economies, that presents risks to investment flows and to energy security and energy transitions, even given that investment in clean energy technologies is typically more capital intensive. Another imbalance, which was highlighted briefly on that first slide, is between the fall in energy demand and the fall in investment, particularly visible for oil and gas. Demand come down by 8% for oil in 2020, around 3% for gas, but investment in new oil and gas supply down by more than 30%. So there's huge cyclical and structural pressures on the industry and on economies that are highly dependent on hydrocarbon revenue. But we need to be aware that if demand gets back to anything like its pre-crisis levels, then this could spell new price cycles, new market volatility down the road. And this slide highlights one aspect of this, the outlook for US shale. US shale has met more than 60% of the growth in global demand for oil and gas over the last decade, and it remains a force to be reckoned with. But the post-COVID shale industry will not be the same as the one that we've seen so far. And this slide illustrates the difference in production outlook between a world in which US shale stays at, when investment in US shale stays at 2020 levels, that's the lower end of this range, versus one where investment gets back to the record levels that we saw in 2014. And that's obviously an area which we'll be looking at very closely. And that speaks to a broader issue, the pressure on oil and gas producers. In the Middle East, income from oil and gas has been cut by half in 2020. For some other producers, the reduction even higher. We're all aware of the cuts to personnel, projects and spending. And this comes at a time when many companies are under pressure from investors to clarify the implications of energy transitions for their business models. And what we did, we looked at the pressures not through production, but by the money to be made from oil and gas and how this changes as a result of the pandemic. And this is what producers could see prior to COVID. And this, so our estimation that because of near-term reductions in the outlook for prices, the pandemic has already reduced the present value of future income from oil and gas and coal by around a quarter. And a prolonged pandemic would bring this down even further, as would a strengthening of policies to accelerate energy transitions. Plenty of evidence of the pressure that this creates for company strategies, but of course, it also underlines the importance of efforts to diversify and reform economies that are highly dependent on hydrocarbons. One brighter spot from a global energy outlook perspective is renewables. Combination of policy support, technology cost reductions, and low financing costs has made investment in renewable power a really compelling value proposition. This is the picture in 2019. So prior to the crisis, renewables were the second largest. If you take all the renewable sources together, they're the second largest source of power after coal. But in our view, there will be this landmark shift by 2025 where renewables overtake coal as the main element of global power generation. And there's multiple elements in play there. Hydro still remains the largest single element of that. But of course, all that growth is coming, or almost all that growth is coming from wind and from solar PV. And let's not forget that as we rely more on electricity and as wind and solar play much greater roles in the energy system, the rest of the system cannot stand still. So we need major investments in grids and in other sources of flexibility to accommodate that rise. But there are some warning signs also for other crucial pillars of clean energy transitions, particularly energy efficiency. One effect of the pandemic, which you can see on the slide here, was to reduce the amount of investment and the improvements in the overall energy intensity of the global economy. So we shouldn't imagine that all of those critical elements of energy transitions have somehow received a boost from the pandemic. Far from it. Finally, a word on emissions. This is roughly where our expectation was for global CO2 emissions prior to the pandemic. This is where we end up in a scenario where we get the pandemic under control in 2021. And this is what would happen if there is a delayed recovery. And if you compare the reasons for that change between those, between the blue line and that orange line for delayed recovery, you can see that, in a sense, the gains that you get from a delayed recovery in terms of emissions, they happen for all the wrong reasons. They happen because of less activity. They happen because of that economic slump that reduces energy use. But we don't see what we would need to see in order to put the global energy economy onto a more sustainable path. We don't see that acceleration in structural change both in the way that we produce energy and the way that we consume it. That would be pivotal for a sustainable recovery and for a long-term answer to climate change. So, Sean, with that, I hope that's given a flavor of some of the analysis that we've done in the World Energy Outlook, and of course, very interested to hear any reactions or questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. And again, welcome anybody who wants to put a question to Tim, just post it on the chat group. Tim, my follow-up is that through the course of 2020, the IEA, and not alone in this situation, sort of continually revised down its sort of expectation on demand recovery for 2021. I'm wondering, what does that look like now? I mean, it's in some ways the first half of 21 reminds me a lot of the second half of 2020. There was a lot of optimism at first that it was going to be a bionic V-shaped recovery, and as time went on, that got corrected. What's your outlook? What's the IEA outlook? And do you expect that sort of revisions to be the trend this year as well?
Yeah, well, of course, that's been very closely watched. And as you rightly say, views have oscillated somewhat. On occasions we, we've had some good news on vaccines, but then, you've had more virulent strains of the virus appearing. So there has been this constant oscillation that you mentioned. So one thing from our side, we look more at the long term, but from a very early point last year, we were aware of the risks, the downside risks, and we were rather skeptical from the start about the prospects for a V-shaped recovery. That's why we built into our World Energy Outlook this delayed recovery scenario. And indeed, but if you look at the 2021, the latest version of the oil market report, you'll see that there is some recovery this year, but it's a little bit hesitant, and we certainly don't get back to 2019 levels of oil demand everywhere. There are, however, some interesting exceptions, and I would like to highlight just one example. China, by all accounts, oil demand has rebounded to something close to pre-crisis levels, and I think that's an indication that as things stand, as the economy recovers, unless we see additional structural changes, you will see pressures on oil consumption continuing to rise from increased demand for mobility. So the duration of the pandemic affects when that will happen. But unless you see greater action from policy side, you're not going to see the sort of early peak and rapid decline that would be consistent with tackling climate change.
When you look at the structure of the markets at the moment, and we saw it only last week in the point of view of OPEC plus, this sort of construction where OPEC plus went ahead with an increase as had previously been indicated, and then Saudi Arabia made a unilateral cut of 1 million barrels. I mean, my question ultimately is that this looks structurally fragile, that this sort of month by month piecemeal approach to managing the global markets. I'm wondering, from the IEA's outlook, how do you consider that OPEC plus as a stable sort of shepherd of the markets. You'd have to acknowledge they've had success, but it does look like a fragile platform. We saw in March, April, when it broke down before COVID really kicked in, when the Russians and the Saudis fell out a little bit, that the market became imploded essentially, and then obviously that accelerated with the COVID. But nonetheless, I'm wondering what the IEA's outlook is on the structure of the global market resting on the shoulders of this relative fragile multilateral group.
I mean, I think we need to cast our minds back to, the spring of last year, when it was clear that the COVID-induced reduction in demand was such a shock to the system that it was really beyond the capacity of the supply side to adjust. There was a number of efforts, including efforts in which the IEA participated to bring greater stability to the market. And as you said, there has been some success in that respect. But like all of us, producers are grappling with huge uncertainty about where this goes from here. And that's not just in terms of economic recovery, but indicators that we wouldn't necessarily normally be looking at. Levels of trust in different countries about vaccines, vaccination rates in different parts of the world, which, as you can see from the data that are coming through, they really vary very widely indeed.
I was actually quite surprised from our forum this morning in the Asia section of the forum that the vaccine rollout, or the challenge of it, was actually raised by many of the speakers as an issue of concern for the outlook of 21.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm talking to you from France today. And if you look at the comparative indicators from various public policy polling institutes, France has amongst the highest share of skeptical population anywhere in the world, and so we're very interested to see how that plays out here too. But certainly we're getting used to looking at some of these unusual indicators when we think through market developments for 2021 and beyond. We still have in mind that it is a challenge to bring this virus under control in 2021. In many markets, that is going to be really tough. And so, that delayed recovery scenario that we prepared for the World Energy Outlook this year, or last year, is unfortunately still very much in play.
One of the questions that have come through, Tim, is about the idea of peak oil demand. It was a big phrase that emerged last year. We've obviously had in the past peak oil supply, but BP, or rather, was it BP? It was BP who brought it very much to the fore last year, that we are in the era of peak oil demand, very unlikely to return to 2019 levels. What's the IEA's outlook on peak oil demand?
Well, that was a key question that we tried to look at in the World Energy Outlook 2020. So normally we're trying to think, well, what's demand going to be in 2030, 2040? But the key question for us is, did it peak in 2019? And the answer to that really depends on policy in our view, because as things stand, and if with the sorts of pace of change that we see on the structural side, it's not enough in our view to deliver a peak anytime soon. Under present circumstances, growth in the economy, recovery in the economy, will sooner or later bring oil demand back to 2019 levels. The 2020s, in our view, is set to be the last decade in which you're likely to see increasing oil demand. But we still don't see that the necessary conditions in place for oil demand to peak, or for 2019 to have been that peak.
I mean, in that sense, we've kind of entered the demand the peak demand decade, but not necessarily the window of it. Ultimately, if that is the case, where do you think things go? I mean, is all 21 about vaccine, or are there other issues that will drive demand recovery that are noteworthy?
I think it is, in the near term, it's about things like that, indicators like that. But I think the other near-term indicator that we are very focused on at the IEA is, are policymakers building in sustainability to their recovery strategies? And there have been a handful of incidences, particularly in Europe, but also in places like Korea, Canada, and New Zealand, where that has been the case. Very interesting to see what happens in the US. But if you are also going to see an acceleration of commitments to electrification of end uses and the rollout of that infrastructure, if you see more car makers, but particularly light trucks and even heavier transportation looking at alternative fuels and electrification, that will give you some important indicators, not necessarily for 2021, but certainly for the second half of the next decade.
Tim, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your lecture today. Really, really important, and drew a nice size audience, because clearly everybody looks to the IEA for some finger in the air to where this year will go. It's hard to remember a year that has begun with so much weight on its shoulders in terms of delivering a new dawn, and clearly any crystal ball gazing based on the kind of research you guys do is very helpful. So Tim, thank you very much for that. We're now going to go into the European plenary session. We've got a feature interview with the OMV CEO and a feature interview with the former chairman of Shell, which I'm really looking forward to, Sir Mark Moody-Stewart. So thank you very much, everybody. Please join us in the plenary session after we close out this particular meeting. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Sean.